Thank you, Donald. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm here in Brussels. Today was going to be a big day. Today was the day that the British Prime Minister was going to trigger Article 50. But it hasn't happened because of those noble people in their Lordship's house. More of that later. But the big debate, the big argument that is going on in the UK today follows the solemn service that took place on Horse Guards Parade this morning, where a monument was unveiled commemorating the 300,000 men and women who took part from 1990 right through to 2015 in the war after the invasion of Kuwait, then Afghanistan, and then, of course, most controversially, the Iraq War. And the Queen was there, as you absolutely would expect, and the Prime Minister was there, Jeremy Corbyn was there, and all of that was pretty uncontroversial. But one man who was there, sitting there, was Tony Blair. And there has been an absolutely furious backlash online, led by family members of those who were killed in the Iraq War, who themselves did not even receive invitations today. Well, clearly, that was deeply insensitive and wrong. But should Tony Blair have been there? Should he have been there? Because there's a lot of controversy over this. Let's face it, we had the dodgy dossier. We've had the Chilcot report. There are many who think that Blair took us to war on a false premise, and that's why they're saying it would have been better if he'd absented himself. I have to say that my view is it would have looked even worse if he hadn't turned up. So I don't think he had much choice but to be there. That's certainly my view. But I wonder what Barbara in Edinburgh makes of Blair on Horse Guards Parade this morning. Barbara, good evening.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. Thanks for everything. I won't keep you. Yes, I thought exactly the same thing. I said to my husband, I won't believe it, Tony Blair sitting there. But in a way, I agree with you that perhaps it would have looked stranger had he not been there. But I think that he wanted to be there, because I think that's his nature.
I mean, he does actually. Barbara, he still, whenever he's asked about this, he still believes that it was the right thing to do, doesn't he?
Yes, I think so. I don't think he really understands. I think it's just his nature, because I think he's got that kind of lack of sensitivity, that lack of empathy kind of nature. And then he can actually fake his sensitivity. I believe that. Do
you? So you've got quite a low view of Tony Blair, Barbara, haven't you?
Very much. In fact, I never ever approved of him at all. But then again, I'm quite a good. I can read people quite well.
Well, there we are. Well, I'll make sure I avoid you. But I mean, do you think, Barbara, is it your view that he took us to war in Iraq on a lie?
I believe that. I believe that wholeheartedly, and I know I'm not alone. Obviously, there's many people who said it was a complete lie.
You're not alone by any means at all, and I thank you very much, Barbara, for your call. John in Formby, was it right that former Prime Minister Tony Blair was sitting there with the Queen and the other dignitaries this morning on Horse Guards Parade?
No, he shouldn't have been there. I take your point that he would have had problems if he'd stayed away. In other words, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. But he's such a toxic character. I think, by and large, particularly with respect to the bereaved, he should have stayed away. I would also make the point that I think if it hasn't already started, it will start. There will be an establishment campaign to try and rehabilitate Blair's reputation.
Wow, that's going to take... I tell you what, John, the PR firm that takes on that contract's going to make a lot of money, aren't they?
Not if they're paid by results.
Right. So you think he's beyond rehabilitation, do you, in terms of the public image?
Yes. I think after a while there can be a bit of forgive and forget, but I think it's up to those who remember what happened to ensure that he doesn't get away with this. I mean, his beloved wife, Cherie, has been going around claiming that, as Prime Ministers go, he's up there with Churchill. And I would only agree with that if you would confine the analysis to Churchill and the Dardanelles. I think there are parallels there, but beyond that, I do not see Blair as a great historical figure. I see him as a disaster.
Well, the difference, I think, the difference, John, with the Dardanelles is that we were at war with Germany and her allies. That war had begun. And so you could argue that actually Churchill had good reason to push the Dardanelles and then subsequently the Gallipoli campaign. It's just that it was very badly thought through and it failed. But the difference is we were at war, okay? Here, the question surely is, did Saddam Hussein pose a threat to us and world peace? And that, I think, is questionable, don't you?
Yes, I'm going to disagree with you slightly, Nigel. I think that what Blair did with Iraq is rather like disobeying military orders. If you pull it off, you'll get away with it. But he didn't. There was a complete pig's ear made of it. And I'm no fan of George Galloway, but he's quite right when he says that Blair's cure was worse than the disease.
Yes, I get that, John. I get that point, John. But, John, you conclude that Blair should not have turned up today, do you?
Yeah, I just think he should keep out of this Brexit thing. I think he should just, to put it in polite words, go away and perish, basically.
John, from Formby, you've made your views on Mr. Blair very clear indeed, and I thank you. I suspect, listeners, that what John really wants to do is to sort of send Blair off to St Helena or somewhere like that. I wonder what Leon in Portsmouth thinks of Blair's presence on Horse Guards Parade this morning. Leon, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. What do you think?
Good. Well, I think Mr. Blair, again, like you said, is a toxic man completely. He should not have been there at all. I mean, there's families who have been watching this at home who may not have been invited that have just thought, look, this man has got my family member killed. Like, it's just wrong. This is wrong completely.
So you think, Leon, that him being there effectively was rubbing salt into the wounds, do you?
Yeah, yes, definitely, 100%. I think Tony Blair, since he stopped becoming Prime Minister, he has got his nose stuck in Brexit when he shouldn't have at all. None of his business. And I think, he should just stay out of it.
But he's also, Leon, I mean, he was a peace envoy in the Middle East, wasn't he?
Yeah, well,
you couldn't really invent that, could you? You couldn't really invent the fact that he was a peace envoy after everything that happened. Now, Leon, I mean, you take the view that he's toxic, you take the view that he shouldn't be there, and I understand that, and I thank you for the call. But I ask, there must be some Blair supporters out there somewhere. Please, someone tell me that Blair ranks up there with Churchill in the all-time ratings, and that it was right and proper for us to go to war in Iraq, and that it was right and proper that Blair was there on Horse Guards Parade earlier on today. Andy in Hampshire, what do you think? Should Blair have been there?
Hi, Nigel. Yes, of course he should. As the man at the top at the time, I mean, it's a mark of respect towards the actual servicemen who gave their lives to the country. He made the decision to sort of send the boys in. You have to stand by that, irrespective of my political views or whatever. To actually send those boys to war and then not turn up at the funeral, in my opinion, would have been a real spit in the face to the families.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't actually a funeral, was it? But it was the unveiling of a memorial. But no, I have to say, Andy, I do understand the callers, and we've got some texts and tweeters now. I do understand that people are upset. I do understand that it looks awful that some of the bereaved families did not get invitations. I get all of that. But I'm with you. He was the guy in charge at the time. He made that decision, I suspect for reasons that many would not approve of, but actually it was his responsibility, wasn't it, to be on parade today?
Well, of course, yeah. And let's not forget as well, although Tony Blair was a figurehead for the country, I'm a great believer in it's little grey men who stand behind the scenes in Whitehall who really make the decisions. Irrespective of which Prime Minister we have at the time, there's always a lot of people, a lot of advisors in the background who pass on comments, pass on sort of policy, all the rest of it. If you like, to me, I see a Prime Minister more as a figurehead. Policy is made in little rooms in Whitehall, but basically long before they actually come out sort of to the public.
Yeah, well, actually, most policy, I would argue, Andy, over the last 40 years has actually been made in big glass and steel structures here in Brussels. But you're quite right. The civil service does have enormous power, though I suspect that in the case of going to war in Iraq, actually that had more to do with the Prime Minister and his immediate team. But no, Andy, you make the point. It was right that he was there because he was the guy in charge at the time. What does Stuart in Edinburgh think?
Good evening, sir. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm fine. I think he had to be there. I think it was his responsibility. But some people, Stuart, take a very different view.
Well, I told your colleagues there that I'm an ex-serviceman. I was actually there for Optelic 1, the first initial operation in Iraq.
Yes.
And, you know, I had a friend killed over there. And, you know, we were over there. We weren't there for British interests. We were there as a puppet of America. And we shouldn't have been over there. And the problems I've mentally went through after that Iraq. I mean, I understand all servicemen, we signed that line knowing the risks that we were going to put ourselves through, but the fact that we've done it needlessly, and it was an illegal war, you know, and we've been condemned since we got back from Iraq.
Stuart, do you feel...
Memorial is a bit of a spit in the face to myself and other servicemen like myself.
Stuart, I mean, I know that there's been huge criticism of Blair, Alistair Campbell, the decision to go to war and the reasons for it. Do you actually feel as an ex-serviceman that you yourself have carried some of the blame for this?
Well, yeah. I mean, you look at what's going on in the streets of the UK and in England specifically, because you had troops coming home and you had these, how do I say this in the right way? You had sort of from the Muslim population, you had gentlemen that were riled up and they were shouting things like baby killer, rapist. These gentlemen who had done nothing more than serve their country, and they were coming home in a celebration parade. And to have someone like him who orchestrated all of that is a spit in the face to all of us. And none more than my good friend Jimmy McHugh, who died over there.
Stuart, you've made some very, very powerful and strong points. And of course, you talk about things being said in the streets by the Muslim population. Don't forget the whole point of these wars was actually to make the streets of Britain safer and better and to bring our communities together. And I think you're right. It did actually have the completely opposite effect. And I thank you. Well, ever controversial, Tony Blair took this country to war in Iraq. It was, without doubt, the most controversial political decision taken in modern times. And, of course, we had the Chilcot report, which went on for years, and I was assuming would be a normal kind of whitewash, but far from it. The Chilcot report was damning. It said the UK chose to join the invasion before the peaceful options had been exhausted, that Blair had exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, that our intelligence agencies had produced flawed information, and perhaps worst of all, it was the comment of Blair to George Bush, "I'll be with you, whatever," at the time when there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein at all. And that, I think, is why there is so much anger about the Iraq war, about Blair. I suspect in years to come it's the issue that will define him in history. And that's why I'm asking you the question, should he have been there on Horse Guards Parade today ahead of the unveiling of a memorial that commemorates the 300,000 people who fought in Kuwait, Afghanistan and in the Iraq war? And I wonder what Ollie in Hertfordshire thinks. Ollie, should he have been there?
Hi, Nigel. I just wanted to first thank you for what you've done for our country. I think it's very good of you to have self-seated yourself up like that.
Very sweet of you, but we're not talking about me. We're talking about Mr. Blair. And should he have been there today on parade?
Well, I'm not too sure, but what I think is, now I'm not a supporter of Blair. I think what Blair stands for is the very antithesis of my political ideology. But I don't necessarily think Blair should have been targeted in particular when other prime ministers succeeding him have taken us to war in places such as Syria and Libya on false pretenses, which have caused similar levels of devastation, although not the same level of loss of our soldiers.
Yes, I mean, I think I agree with that. I think actually the Libyan decision, which was spearheaded by David Cameron, was probably an even worse political decision than Iraq, given that we'd seen what happens to a country when you topple a secular dictator. So I would agree with you. I think Libya was a dreadful decision. It's just that we don't have that level of grieving families that we have from the Iraq war. I agree with that, Ollie. But on balance, he was the guy in charge. He had to be there today, didn't he, really?
Exactly, yeah. But I think that if people are going to scrutinise Blair, they should also scrutinise Cameron, who attempted to take us to war in Syria the first time on the pretense that we were going to take Assad out, and then next tried to take us to war again, saying that it was all about ISIS, where in fact their actions were pointed towards that they're actually trying to still take out Assad.
Ollie, you make a superb point. Mr. Cameron, and indeed William Hague, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, they should not be exempt from criticism. And yet, there was no sort of anger directed at Cameron today. It all, by the looks of it online from the families, is being directed at Blair. But Ollie, you make a superb point. Your texts and tweets, the war happened. Blair was PM. He had every right to attend, says Gregory. Lee says on Facebook, Tony Blair wants to return to the limelight in order to prevent Brexit. Well, I tell you what, Lee, if that's the plan, it isn't going very well, I don't think. Rose says it was totally insensitive and showed a lack of respect to the families of the bereaved. And Stephen on Facebook says, do the Americans hate Bush? I don't hear much hate towards him, unlike the way the British call Blair a war criminal. Stephen, I think, let's go back to the Chilcot report. I think it's not because he took us to war, it's because he basically, as it looks, cooked up the evidence to find an excuse to take us into a war that he'd already decided he was going to join George W. Bush in. What people don't like isn't decisions that go wrong and are costly. What people don't like is a feeling they were conned and not told the truth. And that, I think, is what provokes the anger about Blair, and I think will, actually, for decades to come. I wonder what Tom in Dartford makes of this debate about Blair. Tom, good evening.
Nigel, how are you?
I'm well. Should he have been there? Tom?
No, of course he shouldn't. I've served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and I find it utterly insulting that he had the sheer audacity to turn up and show his face after what he's done. And that, as well as Brexit, is just him trying to hold the limelight, I think.
Well, I tell you what, Tom, as a veteran of those conflicts, just listen in and stay with me a second. Let's just listen to what Tony Blair said last year about the Iraq war and just see how you feel about this.
The decision to go to war in Iraq and to remove Saddam Hussein from power in a coalition of over 40 countries led by the United States of America was the hardest, most momentous, most agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as British Prime Minister. For that decision today, I accept full responsibility. Without exception and without excuse. I recognise the division felt by many in our country over the war, and in particular, I feel deeply and sincerely, in a way that no words can properly convey, the grief and suffering of those who lost ones they loved in Iraq.
Well, Tom, there was Tony Blair speaking last year after the Chilcot report had been released and had been very critical of him. His voice, I thought, they're cracking with emotion. Do you buy into what Blair said?
I think just listening to that, I think just makes your eyes roll, doesn't it, really? I don't think he's sincere at all. I don't believe a word he said. No, I just think he's just a very good actor, I think, like most politicians, obviously apart from himself. If you're saying he was acting or hamming it up, well, I'm not in a position to judge that, Tom. But no, you obviously feel insulted that he was there and the way in which he behaved. One last quick question for you. Do your other fellow veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq feel as you do about Blair? I can't speak for all of them, but I can say most of the people that I've spoken to they'd probably agree that, like a lot of people have said, we went there under false pretences. We weren't entirely sure there were weapons of mass destruction and all the stuff that Saddam allegedly had hidden. And let's be honest, we didn't really find much of them was out there. So I think a lot of people would agree with the way I feel about it, yes.
Yeah, because normally, returning armies, however tough it's been, whatever losses they've taken, do actually feel, quite a bond with the political leader that made that decision. In this case, Tom, it pretty clearly isn't there. Thank you very much for your call and for reacting to what Tony Blair had to say last year. What does Alex in Nottingham think? Alex, tell me you're a Blair fan, because I haven't heard one yet this evening.
I am a Blair fan, a big Blair fan indeed. He's done a lot for this country, but I think people have short memories. And it shows the disloyalty of this country. Nigel, are you telling me that if America, in their time of need, after 3,000 of their citizens were murdered, asked us to help them out and go to war with them, you'd say no, after all they've done for us?
Well, you're quite right. The Americans have done a huge amount for us. But equally, since 1945, not every foreign policy decision that the Americans have taken has been right. And remember that back in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson said to Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, come on, we've got a special relationship, you must send troops and help us fight in the Vietnam War. And Wilson, very, very wisely, said no. And in saying no, didn't damage the special relationship at all. And so the argument, Alex, is this. You're quite right. Those Twin Towers coming down and the attack on the Pentagon, it was the first time the American mainland had ever been attacked. And it was a huge, huge shock. And by the way, Alex, I was in New York just before Christmas, and I went to visit the memorial downtown in New York where the towers were, saw the photo gallery, saw faces of a lot of people I knew and had worked with and traded with when I was in that in business before politics. But how was the Twin Towers, how was that anything to do with Saddam Hussein?
Well, it's quite obvious. That was a region of the world that between them, the UK and the US and the Allied forces decreed was the area that this terrorism was coming from. Clearly, Al-Qaeda wasn't from France, they wasn't from Thailand, they wasn't from Russia, they were from that region. So we went there and dealt with it, or tried to deal with it, until the extreme left and the extreme right joined forces and pulled us out too early, and we didn't get the job finished, left a vacuum, and now there's ISIS.
Well, actually, I think what we did, Alex, I'm going to disagree very strongly with you here, what we did is we got rid of secular dictators, and the situation that's followed on has actually opened the door for ISIS to be the force that they are today. We got this strategically, Alex, completely and utterly wrong, didn't we?
But not necessarily, because the trouble is, the world is a better place without somebody like Saddam Hussein in it. That's a fact, okay? But it's only a better place if you're given the materials and, given the ability and the time to make the country safe and secular after that person's left. But Saddam Hussein went, and we had a constant battle at home, almost a civil war between, and it began with the extreme left attacking the government for going in and waging what they saw as anti-Muslim war. That was all it was about to them.
Do you honestly, Alex, think that Libya is better now than it was before Cameron and Sarkozy got rid of Gaddafi?
That was a half-baked plan that didn't include, look at
well, I tell you what,
Alex, a few bombs, whipped up a storm, and that was it.
It's immeasurably worse. And I mean, the point I'm making, okay, fine, you're a fan of Blair, you believe we had to stand by the Americans, but the point I would make, Alex, is going to war should be the last resort. And I think too often with our leaders in the last 25 years or so, going to war has been something that they've wanted to do virtually at the drop of a hat. Alex, I thank you. So Tony Blair attends the unveiling of a memorial to those that fought in Kuwait, Afghanistan and Iraq, and provokes a storm of outrage, especially from the families of the fallen, many of whom weren't even invited, which seems quite extraordinarily awful to me. My own view is that Blair was the boss at the time, and whatever decision he made, and I think it was a very bad decision, I think it was a very dishonest decision, but I think he had to be there, because I think if he hadn't been, he'd have been called a coward and accused of running away. But before I return to that, I'm here in Brussels tonight. It is March the 9th. It was going to be a big red-letter day, because the plan was, as all 28 heads of state come together tonight in Brussels for a dinner, and Mrs May is in town already, that she was going to deliver, triggering Article 50. It was going to happen today. It was going to be a massive event and a huge summit tonight and tomorrow morning. But it hasn't happened. And we're now nearly 9 months since we voted for Brexit. And frankly, nothing has happened at all, because we've been frustrated, haven't we, by courts and now by the House of Lords. So I'm pretty frustrated about that. But perhaps worse, the discussion that is going on here today is about money. And Monsieur Barnier, the French commissioner who is going to negotiate Brexit on behalf of the European Commission, is telling us that when we leave, we're going to have a bill of 50 or 60 billion pounds. And I'm not going to be privy to that dinner this evening, but I suggest that what Mrs May does is tell Monsieur Barnier that he can whistle for it. We'll find out what gets said in the morning. But back to Tony Blair attending this morning the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and all of the controversy around it. Jerry in Cliftonville is our first caller after the break. Should Blair have been there?
Yes, of course he should. I'm a pro-Farage person.
Right.
But I think you're dead wrong when you talk about Blair. I seem to recall that everyone says that he took us to war. Well, that's not really so. I mean, Parliament took us to war by 412 votes to about 100 and something. All the Western governments had the same information that Blair had, and in fact it's on the computer, so anyone could read it now to make their minds up. And I just think this whole making him a pariah is terrible. I mean, he should be remembered for other things like the Good Friday Agreement or the Sierra Leone clear-out, things like that.
Well, no, Jerry, fine, but Jerry, as I said earlier, I think the problem, had Blair said to us, right, we're going to go to war in Iraq with the Americans. We're doing it to get revenge for what happened at the Twin Towers and at the Pentagon. And we're doing it because we want regime change. We want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we've got a great long-term plan to put into place for Iraq. If he'd done that, yes, we would have lost lives and gold. But what he...
Nigel.
Right, exactly. Well, Jerry, exactly. And they didn't exist, Jerry.
Well, they did exist because he had used them against the Kurds and also in Iran as well. I mean, definitely had them, and all the intelligence reports said that he did have them, and all the Western governments believed he had them. So how is it Blair's single fault?
I'm sorry, wrong? Jerry. I'm Jerry. The idea that we could all be wiped out within 45 minutes by Saddam Hussein was nonsense. And I saw, some of those Scud missiles that he had, this great terror weapon. Do you know what? They weren't even as efficient as the German V2s were that attacked London in 1944 and 45. And Jerry, that's the problem. They cooked up the evidence. Britain's intelligence agencies were in on it. Alistair Campbell was in on it. And they took Parliament through this decision on what was false information, Jerry. You clearly don't accept that.
Find any of these 412 people that would agree nowadays that it was right. You can't. There's none left. They've all changed their minds. It's ridiculous.
I know that. Apart from Tony Blair, you heard from that clip earlier, Tony Blair is wholly unrepentant about this. And I just think, Jerry, we've got ourselves involved in too many wars, and I think we've made the world a worse place. But, Jerry, I thank you for your passion, and I wonder what Beverley in Beaconsfield thinks about Mr. Blair and attending that service this morning.
Hello, Nigel. Thank you so much for taking my call. I'd like to say that from 1997 to 2005, I worked at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down. And I worked with botulinum toxin, which is the most toxic substance known in terms of the minute amount which constitutes a lethal dose. And it was one of the things that Saddam Hussein was supposedly stockpiling. And my immediate line manager had been a UN inspector in Iraq in the early 90s. And he was certainly of the opinion, as were most people in Porton Down, that if they couldn't find anything in 2003, it was because it wasn't there. I couldn't understand why Tony Blair seemed to have a different opinion from that of the scientific experts. And because I like to think the best of people, I thought perhaps he was gullible and naive and had been poorly advised. But when I said that to someone, they said, we don't want someone gullible and naive running the country. But I don't actually think he was gullible and naive. I think he believed what he wanted to believe. And
Yeah.
I don't know. After the publication of the Chilcot inquiry, it did seem that he had been poorly advised in some respects. And after the publication of that inquiry, Tony Blair did seem at that stage a bit like a broken man, but not broken enough.
Yes, I mean, some of our callers think he was faking it, and that perhaps is a little bit unfair. But Beverly, I mean, you know, your expert witness testimony on this is really, really fascinating. But do remember, he'd said to George Bush, "I will be with you, whatever." He decided he was going to do it, and they basically, didn't they? They cooked the books, the dodgy dossier, and that was the excuse. That was the reason why Parliament supported him doing it. And it was wrong, Beverly, wasn't it?
It was absolutely wrong. And then there was that dreadful business of David Kelly, who was the world expert in the field. And I don't know, the whole thing was just dreadful. Everything.
It is actually a shaming episode, Beverly, and thank you very much for that inside knowledge on the fact that they couldn't find any serious weapons of mass destruction. We're going to the United States of America. We're talking to Michelle in Cincinnati. Michelle, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nigel. You're actually here with me and my sister, Leah. We have a YouTube channel. I'm not going to pitch it, but we've gained a lot of UK subscribers because of some videos we've done on you. We're a huge fan. So I've been trying to tell you through. It's my sister's birthday in a couple of days, which was kind of be a surprise to get through. They're going to be shocked that we made it through. So I'm recording this to put on my channel. But anyway, as far as Blair goes,
make your point, Michelle. Yeah, go on.
All right. So as far as Blair goes, I really just feel like if I were him, deep down inside, I would be hanging my head in shame. Because you have to know. It has to hit you really hard. I mean, it would be the same thing if we were doing something similar and Bush was there, you know? It's just, I know that there's a lot of backlash and a lot of veterans are upset, but I think that this is almost like he had to show up. He had to be there just because, I mean, he couldn't not show up. And so I just kind of feel like, I know a lot of you guys think that he is kind of arrogant, and don't get me wrong, he is. But I think deep down inside, he's hanging his head in shame. I think, you know...
Well, you may be right. You may be right, Michelle. Tell me, Michelle, do you sense in America that people are as critical of George W. Bush about the Iraq War as we are of Tony Blair in the UK?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, my sister Leah just said it's almost a joke. I mean, he gets made fun of. Yes, I mean, because... And it shouldn't be a joke. It shouldn't be a laughing matter because lives were lost. Yeah. But
no,
at the same time,
well, Michelle, it's not a joke because a lot of people died, didn't they? You know, they really did. I thank both of you for that call. I wish you well with your YouTube channel, and do ring us again. Thank you. Just down the road from me, the Prime Minister, Mrs May, has just delivered a short press conference in which she said it is still absolutely her intention to trigger Article 50 before the end of the month. Couldn't happen today, of course, because the Lords have somewhat held it up. And she was quite resolute in saying that we are leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe. So quite strong words from the Prime Minister, showing confidence to our European partners that indeed we are going, but in turn they want to charge us between 50 and 60 billion quid. And her response to that will be in private later. And I hope it's even firmer than the words we heard at that press conference. But back to our debate. Tony Blair, should he have attended that service this morning? Would it have been better if he'd stayed away? On Facebook, Steve says, no fan of Blair, but he couldn't win either way. Though out of respect for those he sent to their deaths, he probably should have stayed away. That's Steve's view. Christina says, why is Blair interfering? He has no right to. He left politics. Now all of a sudden he's back. I don't like him. Well, Christina, like him or not, you know, you can argue that getting involved and trying to overturn Brexit is somewhat ridiculous, but he did. My view, he did have to go today. I think not to have done would have looked cowardly and wrong. And Pete says on Facebook, Blair supporters say Saddam had to go. If so, why not Mugabe and Kim Jong, etc., etc.? Well, Pete, that's a perfectly good point. You know, if we were doing this
because Saddam was a bad man. There was a very, very big long list of people who were probably even worse. Let's just hear the words of the Prime Minister from a couple of minutes ago.
Our European partners have made clear to me that they want to get on with the negotiations, and so do I. It's time to get on with leaving the European Union and building the independent, self-governing global Britain the British people have called for. And so, as I have said, we will trigger Article 50 by the end of this month. This will be a defining moment for the UK as we begin the process of forging a new role for ourselves in the world, as a strong country with control over our borders and over our laws. And as the Chancellor made clear yesterday, we will use this moment of change to build a stronger economy and a fairer society that works for ordinary working people by embracing genuine economic and social reform at home. Britain is leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. A global Britain that stands tall in the world will be a Britain that remains a good friend and ally to all our European partners.
Well, I love the words, of course, because they're exactly the same ones that I've been uttering for nearly 20 years here. So that's all good. But it's now been 9 months since the vote. Can we please, please, please get on with it and stand firm and don't let them take away lots and lots of our money. Nigel texts in to say Blair acted on poor advice from those around him, a bit like May, about to lead us into the abyss. Maybe there should be a future inquiry into the disastrous consequences of the UK's exit from the EU. Listen, my namesake, probably by the time we've left, the rest of the thing will be falling to pieces anyway, and we will call it the Great Escape and Liberation for our nation. That's what I think. But let's get back to Tony Blair. Should Blair have been there this morning, or would it have been better, wiser, kinder perhaps, to those who lost people if he stayed away? I wonder what Wayne in Manchester has to say about this. Hello, Wayne.
Yeah,
hi there. What do you think?
He had to be there. And we know he was Blair, he was the Prime Minister, and for us to go to war with America. But we know he's only we all know that they're the puppet. Someone's pulling his strings, whether it's the arms company, America pushing, but still, MI6, MI5, CIA made all that nonsense up about these weapons. We knew that. If you wanted to know what weapons Saddam had, just have a look at the catalogue of what weapons us and the rest of the West, and especially the Yanks, sold him to fight Iran. We knew he had no dangerous biological weapons, because don't tell me you've got a bomb pot like Saddam, and none of us had any agents there, MI6, CIA. We knew what he had, and like Vietnam, it kept a full town in America in work with their arms factories. But he should have been there today, but I feel like I didn't like his talk last year. It sounded false.
You're another one that thinks that way. Well, you're not the first tonight that's thought that. People think he was hamming it up. But I'm with you, Wayne. I think whatever he got wrong, whatever was said, whatever the reasoning, Wayne, I'm with you. I think he had to be there today. I really do. I wonder what Aziz in Islington thinks. Aziz, should Blair have been there today?
Hello, hi. I think he should be there. It's normal because despite what happened, Blair is one greatest UK's politician. Man. Regarding that one, did he write his decision to invade in Iraq or not? It has two phases. We should be too clear about that, because if you're looking at the situation in international law, it was a broken international law because there has no permission from Security Council to intervene in Iraq in 2003. It's completely it's fair. Secondly, regarding the scandal happened, Saddam has a missile, has a chemical weapon, has something, and also he can threaten UK or Europe in 40 minutes or 45 minutes, something like that. Because I am from Iraq and I did politics in Iraq about 20 years, and also I studied politics here in Greenwich University here. I think such things been talking regarding Saddam Hussein was most of them is right, but there is some wrong with the situation happened with Saddam as well, because Saddam has no like they say no nuclear power. He has no. But
Aziz, as an Iraqi, you know, and we now look back at that decision, is Iraq a better place now without him, or have we actually destabilized it and made it worse?
No, because I need to say that, because if you're looking at the situation in humanitarian intervention, he was a good decision. They say being did by United States and United Kingdom and other countries, it was good. They had good plan to remove Saddam from power, but also they had no plan to rebuild Iraq. Also, Iraq, they gave Iraq into Iran's hand, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, okay. Aziz, I mean, this is, you know, clearly you've got deep knowledge on this, but clearly you would agree it's been a fairly mixed result. I've got to get on. I've got a load of people who want to come on, including Anne-Marie in Uxbridge. Anne-Marie, was it right that Blair attended today?
No, I don't think so. I think it would have been offensive to anyone who lost loved ones in Iraq. Like my husband, he lost his son by a previous relationship in Iraq, and he's pretty incensed by him attending. But also, as far as Blair is concerned, the clip you played of his speech last year, I sort of pictured him with a hangdog expression, which is all put on. You know, I think that was all put on anyway. And the other thing is, as the Middle East peace envoy, what's he actually doing? Because I can't see any peace out there.
Well, no, and I have to say, Anne-Marie, this is what I think, and certainly Libya, things are considerably worse, and I think we've meddled in areas and countries we don't really understand. I mean, you know, Iraq itself was actually, the boundaries were drawn on a map in the Foreign Office, and the reason the top northeast corner juts out a bit is because there was a fold in the paper. So we've really, you know, ever since Lawrence of Arabia came up with his plan for a greater Arabia, we've been meddling and meddling and meddling, and Anne-Marie, I think, basically, we are quite responsible for what's happened, and I think we've made things worse. Anne-Marie, I thank you for your call. Joy says, I'm appalled that Blair was there. The most important people to be there were the families of the soldiers. Right, of course, that the royal family were there, because they are ultimately Her Majesty's forces. I have to say, we've had some very passionate phone calls on this subject tonight. I do think that the decision to go to war in Iraq was the most controversial made in politics in modern times. I do think if Blair had been straight with people and said, this is about regime change, this is about revenge, then I don't think, actually, his entire political career would be shaded by this issue. It is the fact that effectively they tried to cook the books. They put together a dodgy dossier, and the British people will never, ever forgive him for that. Having said all of that, he had to be there today. It would have been absolutely shameful and cowardly if he hadn't shown his face on that programme this morning. I will be back with you next Monday. I have enjoyed this week. I hope next week Article 50 finally gets triggered.